Hi, I'm Devin, and I'm publishing assistant for Stanford Social Innovation Review. So, after a day of discussing how nonprofits can utilize data in the here and now, we wanted to close with a forward-looking keynote address. So we invited the executive director of the Institute of the Future, Marina Gorbis, to present on how APIs will affect the social sector. As a futurist, Marina makes a career out of forecasting trends in technology and society. But the first rule of both the futurist and the event planner is always, nothing is certain, and due to an untimely illness, Marina could not join us today. So I'm instead welcoming her colleague, Dylan Hendricks, director of the 10-year Forecast Membership Program, to deliver his intriguingly titled talk, APIs for Good, a Bestiary of the Networked World. Oh, well, let's see. Well, I have a little more. Stanford Social Innovation Review is a media group dedicated to delivering quality content to our audiences through diverse channels: print magazine, website, e-newsletter, webinars, and events. And all of you have interfaced with at least one of our many software-as-a-service platforms. And at least some of you may testify that it isn't always a seamless process. There's a far-off dream of SSIR, of the unified database, where data from our magazine and e-newsletter subscribers, conference and webinar attendees coexist peacefully in a full-service platform that can accommodate all of our information delivery and payment processing needs. But until that day, we need APIs. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and like many of you here today, I don't understand much about them beyond the specific possibilities and limitations they present us at SSIR managing your data for our services. An engineer from our webinar broadcasting platform, TalkPoint, explained it to me best when referring to our email listserv delivery system. There's no API. That means we can't talk to them. So driven by the conviction that good storytelling is the most essential tool for an advancing society, Dylan Hendricks has spent his career producing media pieces for leading companies, nonprofits, and governments. He's an expert in the rapidly changing media landscape, and today he will employ his storytelling skills to present a vision of APIs in an increasingly networked world.
Hello, thank you. It's nice to be with you today. I am from the Institute for the Future, and it sounds like it's out of a comic book, but we're actually an independent nonprofit research organization that's been around for close to 50 years now, and we have an office in Palo Alto on Hamilton, so you should come by and visit us on Emerson and Hamilton there. Unfortunately, we don't predict the future, but for close to 50 years, we have been helping nonprofits, governments, and companies to think systemically about the future and to create tools that allow you to explore foresight, to develop insights that will lead to action in the near term. So I have the privilege today of telling you a story about the future, and it starts with this. So this is the front page of the New York Times from the day I was born, June 19th, 1984. There isn't much to it. It's sort of some rumblings about Moscow and a very 1980s infographic about the proper use of chopsticks. What's interesting about this paper, though, in addition to being the day that I was born, is that it's also a good candidate for the best day the newspaper industry ever had. Newspaper circulation actually peaked in 1984, and 63 million copies of papers with these stories and stories like them went out around America on that day. And that number's been dropping ever since. And this graph doesn't make it look too scary until you compare it to the rise of the number of households in America over the same period of time. And you can see it's dropped from about 80% in 1984 down to 20% now. And even that number is going to look optimistic in a few years. But of course, you don't need to subscribe to a newspaper to know that the newspaper industry has fallen apart. That's not a story from the future, but it is the baseline of the story that I want to tell you today. It's a story that's been happening specifically for my entire life, first slowly, and now very quickly. So we all know kind of what happened to the newspaper industry, right? This once cultural monolith was fragmented into billions of blogs and tweets and BuzzFeed listicles that now propagate the internet. It's interesting to put some numbers to it, though. As I said, there were 63 million daily papers circulated throughout the US in 1984 at its peak. of 1,700 different papers. So if we look at what's replaced it, we could start by trying to measure the number of blogs, right? So there's some 50 million blogs in the world right now with an average 800 million daily page views. And you'll notice that these are global figures, not American figures, because we don't watch or read blogs from our region or our town, right? Our reading habits have become very global. We could try looking at things like YouTube. There's now some 300 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every minute, which is a staggering figure, and 4 billion daily views of those videos. Social media is the hardest to aggregate in terms of what it's done because it's just hard to aggregate all of the different services. But to give you a sense of it, there are some 6,000 tweets sent on Twitter every second, so 6,000. And on Facebook, if you don't count likes or individual posts, just third-party content from any magazine or newspaper or National Geographic that people are sharing on their feed, that happens now some 5 billion times a day on Facebook, which is crazy, right? And so you're with me, right? I mean, this is a story that you've heard some version of before, but it's still not the story that I want to tell you tonight. This is still just the buildup, because what we're seeing is happening across the entire media industry. So we looked at newspapers peaking around 1984. Music industry peaked sometime around 1999. That was especially in terms of the album and the revenue sales that the music industry was able to generate from what it does. So you can see that figure there and how precipitously it's dropped, about 60% since 1999. So to put that in terms of how many units they're putting out, there was some 785 million albums sold in 2000. That's dropped to about 250 million today. But their competitors, so say just take Spotify, the popular music streaming service, streamed some 60 billion albums worth of music to their subscribers last year. The cable industry, its peak will probably be nailed down sometime around 2011, so just 4 years ago. And at that time, they had close to 87% penetration of US households. And this is the scariest graph yet, right? This is dropping precipitously. To give you a sense of how fast that's now changing, in the first quarter of this year, of 2015, the combined cable TV companies in the US lost 200,000 subscribers in that quarter. Netflix, the popular video streaming service, picked up 5 million subscribers at the same time. And so this process that is fragmenting our traditional media industries, the thing is, it's now becoming a generalized process. So it took only 5 years for Uber to have more vehicles, Uber vehicles in New York City than there are yellow taxis, if you can imagine that. Just 5 years from when the company did not exist at all to now there are more of them than the most iconic part of the streets of New York City. And they've disrupted and completely upended the taxi industry everywhere that they've been allowed to do their business. It only took Airbnb 4 years to have more daily rooms checked out worldwide than all of the Hilton hotel chains. And as of this year, just 6 years into Airbnb not being a thing, to now being worth more, valued higher as a company than both the Hilton or the Hyatt and the Wyndham hotel chains combined, right? So both classic American institutions, decades of experience, millions, if not billions of dollars of infrastructure. Airbnb, for their part, owns no hotels. They have no hotel staff, but they're valued higher than these two companies. And then there's something like ResearchKit, right? So ResearchKit just came out earlier this year in March, and it was both announced and released on the same day by Apple. And this is a framework just for iPhones for now, although it's open source and extendable, that allows people to use their iPhones and for research centers to allow people to use their iPhones to conduct formal research through the phone. So it's very limited right now, obviously, the things you can do with a phone, but there's certain things like a Parkinson's test that you can do just by speaking into the microphone. And they can collect this data, the consent forms are there, so you can do formal research this way. Within 24 hours of this thing going from not existing to being in the world, Stanford here announced that they had received more signups for research studies than had previously taken 50 medical centers an entire year to collect, right? So this isn't just a small change, this is an order of magnitude difference. And this is getting to the story that I want to tell you today, because what we're seeing here is not just about data, right? It's not just about a handful of apps and platforms that have disrupted these industries over the last few years. So what is it about? Well, I like storytelling. So it was the media critic and philosopher Marshall McLuhan back in the 1960s who told us first that the medium is the message. And he observed that societies have always been shaped more by the nature of the media by which we communicate than by the content of that communication. And the highly networked world that's emerging around us is not just a set of new technologies. It's not just a creator and storer of data. It's not just a new market. It's an entirely new global medium. It's a complete rethink of how we communicate within our homes, within our businesses, between our nations, at a global level. And it's transforming the way we communicate so fundamentally that even though it started disrupting our media industries, it's now quickly transforming our entire society and all of the organizations that we work at. For all intents and purposes, the networked world is a new world, one that exists in the connections between our phones and our apps and our businesses and our members or constituents, that will soon exist as we head towards the Internet of Things that is being talked about so much, especially here in the Valley. It will exist in the connections between our cars and our appliances, between our identities at a very deep level, between our organizations and our cities. This world has new rules and logics, new pathways for achieving our goals, for working together, and perhaps most importantly for this audience today, has new pathways for manifesting and expressing our values in the world, right? As we wade further into this world over the next decade, it's going to be very uncomfortable for many of us. It's going to feel somewhat like an alien landscape, like things that were recently impossible are suddenly inevitable. But there are rules to it. There is a logic to it. And it's important that we get our bearings quickly, both for ourselves and for our organizations. So today, you've been talking about data with purpose and brilliant panels and speakers to get towards thinking about the really practical, tangible steps that you can take today. I'd like to take more of a safari approach with you tonight, closing out the day, and explore this world through the eyes of one of its native creatures, through one that was born on its soil, that breathes its air and swims in its water. I believe that the habits and patterns of this creature hold the keys to the disruptions that I just described, why they happened, where we might expect to see them happen next. Many of you know this creature by its Latin name, the Applicatus Programmi Facie, more commonly known as the API. Now, most of you have heard of this creature before, know it by a variation of its Latin name, the Application Programming Interface. Some of you even work with it on a very regular basis. But until now, interactions with the API have been largely constrained to the somewhat obscure field of software engineering, right? We think of it as a kind of protocol that sits between our phones and the services that we use, telling different pieces of software how to interact with each other over networks. We know vaguely that it's essential for sharing data between organizations and platforms. We know that it makes Facebook like buttons and YouTube video players propagate across the web. Some of us know that it's even sort of core to the scaling efforts of massive tech giants like Amazon. But unlike the apps and platforms that have gained a lot of mainstream awareness over the last few years, the API has sort of been remained somewhat obscure, rendered in crude drawings like this or this, that really fail to capture the true spirit of this interesting specimen. Drawings like this give the impression that APIs are all roughly the same, right? That they're sterile and they're functional, that they have no unique character or personality of their own. But more importantly, drawings like this and our understanding of APIs gives the impression that they're a relatively minor creature in the networked world and not core to the organizational strategies of the near future. And these assumptions, I believe, are incorrect. So the first thing to know about APIs is that they're elusive. They're flexible and adaptable. They blend in. They dwell mostly hidden in between the things that we're paying attention to and never draw attention to themselves. So to get a closer look at them, you have to kind of sneak up on them. So as the media, hotel, and taxi industries have recently discovered, you often can't tell whether APIs have inhabited your terrain until it's too late, right? Because they're almost invisible, it's usually easy to track them by their impact, by what they do when they enter a new space. I've created a kind of a spotter's guide that I'd like to go through with you this evening. The telltale signs, the signposts, the indicators that your organization, your sector, your industry is either about to enter the networked world or is about to enter the next level of it, and that APIs are soon going to be a very big part of what you do. So there's 4 things to the spotter's guide. And the first thing to know about the API creature is that APIs love to eat away the line between producers and consumers. They love to do this. The distribution channels of the 20th century were largely one-way rigid transactions, right? You create something over here, you develop authority over here, and then you bring it over here, and then you distribute it to people. You bring authority and products and services to people. But as more and more of our organizations, as our services, of our data, as more and more of them are mediated by APIs like this, that is an inherently two-way interaction. So the lines between those, between you and between your constituents are going to be blurred. It's going to happen. It doesn't mean that businesses and their customers or organizations, governments and their citizens are going to become completely interchangeable in every way. But if there's anything to be gained in your sector by blurring this line between traditional production and consumption, it's important to know that if they haven't already, APIs are going to make this much easier than it's ever been. So an example of this is, so this is the nodal two-way one. So an example of this is Uber and Airbnb, right? So if you download the Uber app, there are some slight business reasons why it's a little bit more difficult, but functionally from the point of view of that app, it is just as easy to become a driver for Uber as it is to become a passenger. When you download the Airbnb app, it's just as easy to rent out a room as it is to find a room to rent. These two-sided markets, this ability to create very pure two-way connections between people who traditionally have had authority and people who have just gained it by virtue of this data and these devices, these are the kinds of disruptions to be looking for as just a very first low-hanging fruit of what APIs are going to do in your sector. There's a company called Betabrand in San Francisco that is a great example of this. And so they're a retail company. They're very hip. It's sort of like an Urban Outfitter, something along those lines. And rather than create an entirely two-sided market where you sort of could bring clothes or buy clothes, they've just taken certain aspects of what they do and used APIs to create two-sided markets with it. So in addition to designing their own clothes, they actually have a small batch prototyping and manufacturing plant within their store. And they have an online community where they invite their fans and designers to submit designs to them. And it could just be an idea for, I want a hoodie that also works as a business suit, right? That's one that they make. Or it could be something that people are already developing in small batches on their own, and they want a larger market for it. So they can organize that much more easily than they ever could through APIs. If they like the design, they take it, they manufacture it, they sell it, and then they give a portion of those profits back to the designers. They do this even more with their marketing efforts. So I believe that they don't have any actual sort of professional marketing that they hire. Rather than having producers of marketing, producers of fashion, they enlist their own customers who buy their clothes to take photos themselves on social media. If they like the shot and you're okay with them using it, then they will use that to promote their clothing, and then you get a discount the next time you go in there. So they're saving money, you're saving money, everybody's more involved. Another example of this is Flightcar. So Flightcar nominally is in the airport parking business. So you bring your car to the airport and you pay a certain amount and then they'll park it for you, right? But they thought, well, why take a perfectly good car and just let it sit in a perfectly good space? There's no reason to do that. So what they'll do instead is for the duration of your trip, they will rent out your car to other people and then share that profit back to you. Now that seems crazy, right? This is the alien landscape that I'm talking about. The idea of just giving your car, okay, good luck, I hope it's back here when I come back. But APIs can communicate data at such a fine granular level that things like risk management, things like reputation of the drivers, of the passengers, all of that can be mediated much more easily and cheaply than it ever could before. So the longer the trip, the more incentivized you are to use a service like this because you're making more money. Your car parked in the airport is suddenly a small business that you have to do very little to be involved in. Because this is such a low-hanging fruit of APIs, it's going to change your relationship with your constituents regardless of what sector you're in. People are going to start questioning your unquestioned authority that you've previously had to do whatever it is that you do, right? So you generate and distribute power, why can't I generate and distribute power? You manufacture and produce and design shoes, why can't I do that? And why can't they, right? There are probably half a dozen things right now that you provide to your users and constituents that they would be just as happy to provide for themselves at a more peer relationship level. And APIs are going to make that a lot easier to do. So the second thing to spot for is APIs love to find new uses for old resources. So if you start to see things that recently had no value at all, they were idle or stranded assets that are suddenly being leveraged for incredible value, that's a good place to look for APIs that probably inhabited that space. Because whenever an API enters a new sector, it lowers the cost of signaling the availability of something, the existence of something, of signaling that and then connecting people to a way to access it to just about zero. So the overhead of taking a guest bedroom and turning it into a hotel, Airbnb mediates away all of that work. So you just need to know that that bedroom isn't being used tonight, and the APIs can do the rest. My favorite example of this, of a company that we wouldn't sort of think of traditionally as like a very innovative company, is Waffle House. So Waffle House, for those who don't know, is kind of an American institution. They serve breakfast foods to tired families and truckers across a large portion of America. And last year, they partnered with a company, a startup, called Roadie. And Roadie is sort of trying to do like an Uber for package delivery. So rather than have sort of trucks that they buy that are purpose-built for delivering packages, there are lots of people driving across the country all the time. So if you're driving somewhere and you have a little bit of room in your trunk, they'll pay you a little bit of money and they will give you a package to deliver to the destination it needs to go to. And again, the reputation and everything is managed. Now, the odds of you going to exactly where this package needs to go are pretty slim. So they needed a place or a series of places across the country at regular intervals where these packages could be dropped off and then picked up. So enter Waffle House, right? So I highly doubt, we've been talking about where do you start with this stuff, right? Where do you start but using data, both to sort of increase the value of what you're already doing and then to increase the value of that data that you are collecting? I highly doubt that Waffle House has an expertise in delivery, package delivery, or in supply chain management, right? That's not what they're founded on, but the APIs do all of that. So instead, they just get to be a great front end where you come by, you drop off a package, you get a free waffle, right? That's a great, great little business that they've involved themselves in. Another way to sort of think about reutilizing your existing assets to leverage more value from them in the networked world through APIs is from Amazon. So back when Amazon was founded, Jeff Bezos, the CEO, had the forethought to mandate, really, that every department within Amazon, as they were building they just want to sell shoes online at first, but every department, as you build towards that, instead of communicating with each other interdepartmentally about data, so instead of somebody working in inventory asking a question of supply chain, asking a question of the sort of online logistics, rather than doing that in an informal way or providing direct access to the database between those, Jeff Bezos mandated that every organization determine what is it that they do and to derive an API that allows them to do that systematically. So that instead of if you have an internal need, rather than sort of sending an email or a memo, that you would just use the API, right? If it's a problem that you've needed to solve once, solve it with the API and then it's solved for everybody. And this creates very structured access to very modeled data. And as Amazon built out and scaled with this in mind, it allowed them to take their internal capacities that they required to build sort of an online retail giant that looked kind of like this. And by just changing the information access privileges of those things, really just, they've already been set themselves up, but just by changing it from what you are an internal Amazon member so you can access this data, oh, you're a paying AWS customer so you can access this data, right? So they turned it into AWS, into the series of services that were just derived out of their internal capacities that now provide back-end services for organizations with similar needs. Right? So this is a way that you can take the things that you're already good at, and APIs can extend those out as offerings very easily. So there are probably dozens of things that, like the glove box space in a fleet of vehicles that your organization might own, or the parking lot space in a retail location that you have, that can be leveraged very easily by APIs to create new value. The third thing to know about APIs is that they like working together in very unexpected ways, right? They just love working together, and they work very well together. They can work with millions of people at once, and they can work with millions of organizations at once without needing individual people to even know what's happening. You set up an API with a sort of structured social contract of what you're allowed to say to it and what it's allowed to give back to you, and then it can do that millions of times for essentially free. And this allows you, this is really the really future-y one. This is the one that allows you to create experiences that were never before possible. So take, for example, Google Maps, right? So Google Maps, because they have an API with just a few lines of code, whatever service or website you have can have the best mapping and directions technology in the entire world at your fingertips, right? So if you have a bowling website, you can, with a few lines of code, have the best mapping technology available to you. And somebody can go into that mapping technology on your website and find where you are versus where they are and get directions to that place. Now, Uber also has an API. And up until recently, they had provided a service where, through very little technology innovation, connected their API to Google Maps API, so that in the list of ways to get to your destination when you choose it in Google Maps, Uber was one of the options. So imagine you go to this website, you look where the bowling alley is, you push a button, and a car pulls up to come take you there, right? Now, Spotify, the popular music streaming service, also has an API. So imagine now that just with very little technology work done in these partnerships, because they already had APIs, they've created a situation where I've gone to a bowling website, found the directions, the car pulled up, and now I can choose any song that I know of in the entire world to play over the sound system of that car as I'm going towards my location, right? And APIs created that experience. Nobody had developed that internal capacity within themselves. They found people who were doing it really well, and they partnered with them in a way that is more fluid and integrated than anything that was before possible for them. Another example of this is Starbucks. So last year, Starbucks announced that they are offering free 4-year college education to every one of their full and part-time Starbucks employees, right? So that means that if you work 20 hours a week as a barista at Starbucks, you have access to free 4-year college education, which is crazy and does not represent on Starbucks' part some huge investment really in education, right? They didn't start a school. What they did is they partnered with Arizona State University, who has a platform that has these API-like affordances, so that as you scale the number of people using the system, you don't need, in this case, to hire more teachers for each new student, right? Once you've set up that relationship once, the non-material costs of distributing it through the system are just about zero. Now, we can have conversations around whether this is the best form of education. Is this a step forward? That's a very, that's a very different conversation. But the things that it's good at, you can now provide to as many people as you want for free. So it's important to think about the things that it's good at, it's going to be really, really good at. And it allows for organizations to reach across sectors for the first time, to provide benefits to their constituents, to their users, to their members that they are not experts in, right? Because there are APIs in this, if Starbucks wanted to incorporate that education into the experiences that they create within their Starbucks locations, it would be very easy for them to do that. So thinking about what is the best possible experience that I can create for somebody, what benefits do I want to provide them, is now a question that is worth asking, because the answers are going to give you a reason for collecting all this data. The last thing in the Spotter's Guide to talk about for APIs is that APIs build on each other's work. So once a problem's been solved once with an API, it's essentially a solved problem for everybody. So we couldn't have Uber or any of these things until we developed just the basic mapping functionality that Google Maps provides, right? So just give me a real-time map that tells me where I am, and if I point somewhere else, that tells me how to get there. But once you solve that problem, now Uber is just a matter of adding cars to that, to say, okay, tell me where the car is that has somebody that's willing to drive me and where I am, and then they'll connect those things. And then from there, things like Instacart are just a matter of adding one more instruction. Okay, there's a car there with somebody who's available to drive somewhere, have them drive here, and then pick up these groceries, and then deliver them to my house. And I don't know if you've used this service. It's an incredible service. You can literally, it's the Uber for grocery shopping, which if you have young kids like I do, it's a lifesaver. So now once these problems are solved in this technology stack, you can use them, right? Often for free to just start building. And they allow for very niche organizations whose costs of business would have been too high to suddenly have an ability to thrive. So a group like Farmigo. Farmigo is a local initiative that helps farmers who have very small plots of land. So maybe just some small cottage industry farm. Maybe it could be as small as just even your garden farm in your front yard. But the app takes care of communicating the inventory of what you have, of finding somebody who wants to buy it, of negotiating that purchase, of arranging for the pickup of that, and then of delivering the final goods. So all you have to worry about is growing things, right? So whatever you're really good at, you don't need to get really good at the rest of this. Just stay good at that in a way that once the services build up towards you, and this, I mean, this is a sort of a passive thing, but there is going to be an expertise layer heading towards you that necessitates not so much becoming broader in terms of what you understand, but becoming very focused at what you're good at. In a lot of the ways, these APIs act kind of like Legos, right? And they allow for these kind of organizational innovations to snap together, like I've mentioned. And as they do, they create increasingly sophisticated solutions to increasingly sophisticated problems. And this is a big reason why I think we see this sort of train running from the media industry now through taxis, hotels, is because that technology stack is getting better and better at solving more and more complex problems. We see it happening today in the hotel and taxi and media industry, like I mentioned. We're seeing it now happen in the financial transaction industry, right? Financial transactions are currently being mediated by APIs for the first time, and that's the wave that we're currently running through. We're also seeing it happen with health diagnostics. And I expect that over the next 10 years, we're going to see it happen more and more in things like legal mediation and in governance itself. APIs are a new global medium for communicating between organizations and individuals and cities like we've never had before. And they take the shape of these four basic spotting indicators that I've laid out. But once you've identified that there might be APIs in your space, then the next question is, what kind of API? Because, and this is the really important point that I think it's never talked about enough, is that APIs are not all created equal. Once you've created the basic shape of an API, say something that connects passengers to cars, there are lots of subspecies with personalities and characteristics and values that you could create on top of that. There are different ways of organizing those assets, of determining what those contracts are that share things between those organizations, that while they start small, will build out to become larger and larger aspects of how our organizations relate to people and how our cities create effective operational social contracts for people who are living in them. So I'd like to introduce you to a few of these subspecies. The first is what I like to call the competent bureaucrat. So this little critter lives mostly in sort of smart cities and private infrastructure. It optimizes for efficiency and for user experience. It wants to create a magical world where you don't even have to know that the API is happening. Right? So it wants to be sort of like the easy pass for the entire world. You can think of the connection happening of when you drive through the easy pass or the fast track lane, that there is data being communicated between you and that system about who you are, when you pass through the bridge, and how much money that costs. But you don't have to think about it. And the competent bureaucrat lies behind interactions like that. It wants to create a future world where, as everything is interconnected, you can walk into a hotel that you want to stay in, having made no reservation. You can talk to no people, walk to the elevator, it opens, brings you to the floor of where you need to go, and then brings you to a room where the door unlocks as you approach and you go in. Right? It wants to create this world where experiences that would benefit from this kind of like Star Trek utopian magic are possible. That's what it aspires to, by focusing and valuing experience above everything else. Disney's Magic Band is another signal of this from today. So this, if you go to any of the Disney theme parks, it might just be Disney World right now, rather than having to wait in line or check into your hotel, they just give you a band at the beginning when you go in. And when you want to do any of those things, when you want to check into a queue, when you want to buy food, when you want to go to your hotel, you just wave the band. And it uses competent bureaucrat APIs to get that experience to be as frictionless as possible and to get out of your way so that you can navigate those spaces. The competent bureaucrat, if you're thinking about it as an API to use when you're thinking about how to share or model your data, it's good to know that the strengths are that it acts on your behalf. It tries to soak in as much information, as much context as it can from every system around it in order to find the optimal solution for you. And it works with as much information as it has access to. It's thirsty for information. Now, the downside is that it acts on your behalf, right? So it's not creating a choice point. It's not asking you what you want. It's assuming to know what you want. And not every experience is going to require this or is going to benefit from this. But it's good to know that it's there as an option, right? Maybe taxes should be a little bit more like this, but you could turn it off, right? If you want to dive into how much taxes you're paying. And the other downside is that it wants access to everything. So in these two signals I gave, obviously, Disneyland and EasyPass are both a part of very centralized systems that have a lot of information that it can draw on to navigate that transaction. So in order for competent bureaucrats to be useful at the level of governments and organizations and nonprofits such as yourselves, it's going to require high trust relationships where that data is shared broadly between you so that you can have that much bigger picture of what's happening and then make those optimal decisions. The next API creature is the honest merchant, and it values short-term gain and personal choice. So this is the one that maybe we're most familiar with in the sort of API economy that's emerging around us, right? This is the one that acts as kind of a general store, that it wants to sell you things in the traditional way. But as we move forward, it doesn't care what currency you trade, right? In the near future, things like Bitcoin that we see today, APIs make transacting Bitcoin versus sort of standard traditional currency arbitrary. And increasingly will make anything of value have a lower frictional cost for trading. So you can essentially trade in the near future a lot of things that have measurable value as though they are a fungible currency. So this is an innovation that is going to allow for things like trading our identities for access, for trading access to one place for access to another at the same time. It's a transaction, either through bartering or spending. We see that a lot today in things like Uber and Airbnb, right? You could have a system with Uber where as soon as you want a car, it just appears and the transaction happens in the background. But we don't. We have a system where you choose where you want to go, and then you're confronted with an actual cost, right? You have to explicitly pay money to use the service, and that cost might change depending on the time of day or on where you're going. Now, this is fine for services like this. You know, these are all choices to have sort of an explicit transaction of value. But as we use APIs in increasingly granular ways, the friction of choosing to pay for something becomes more and more burdensome, right? So we see that if you're aware of the current sort of free-to-play game thing that's sweeping through a lot of the mobile gaming space, you download a game for free, but then any little advancement, you have to spend actual money, just like $1, maybe 50 cents, in order to buy the gems that allow you to complete the level. It's because it's very easy to implement APIs that have this value transaction built into them. But as we move forward and we're surrounded by these APIs, imagine spending 25 cents by waving your hand in front of the Walgreens, right? Or watching an ad before the doors will open. These things will become possible, but they're not necessarily desirable. So, like I say, the strengths of the honest merchant are that it supports most traditional business models, and it has a very familiar terms of service. But it has an implicitly higher transaction cost that makes it vulnerable to better experiences. So, the next one, the third of the 4 subspecies I'd like to tell you about, is the community maker. And the community maker, I think, is probably a favorite of this room. It's a favorite of mine. The community maker API is the open API, right? It's the one that values collaboration and experimentation. This is the creature that wants to share its data as broadly as possible and believes that even modeling that data too firmly is a form of censorship, right? Now, the problem with the community maker is that it's very difficult to build a business on it, for one. So when Twitter first started a few years ago, they began by just sharing all of their data through open APIs. So anybody could take the Twitter feed data and remix it. And there was this whole explosion of people designing new interfaces and exploring with what Twitter wanted to be that created things like the @ symbol and hashtags. Those were developed by a community of developers that had access to the whole feed. But then Twitter couldn't make money off of that. And so they've closed those down, sort of betraying those relationships in the way that they're set up, and have had a very difficult time pivoting to another business model from there. Because you can't just start open and then eventually end up closed. If it's not going to work to be fully open for the life of your organization, then it's probably not going to work to be fully open. And you're going to need to find a more nuanced mix of sharing your data and then getting value out of your data in whatever way benefits the value model that you are trying to put forward. Another example, obviously, is there's a lot of nonprofits and governments. Data.gov is a great early effort to just share the data. Let's just get it out there. But because there are very few business models and incentives around community maker APIs, the data is often very different in terms of how it's formatted, in terms of what the assumptions were when it was created. And there are not clear paths towards how to use that data right away. You have to do a lot of work to mold that data to what you want it to be. So even though it's trying to set a low bar of accessibility in terms of anybody can access it, to actually use it is actually a much higher bar, right? So the costs are in there. They're just not being distributed in a way that we see. They're just being taken on by whoever wants to use that data. So like I say, the community maker is the best at building trust and community goodwill. It accelerates community innovation. But it requires non-traditional forms of support, right? And it prioritizes openness often over ease of use. It often takes the form of sort of a fire hose. Now, the last of the API creatures is the most elusive. This is the one that we know the least about. And we call it the secret agent. You might have heard of it called the blockchain. It values individual privacy and decentralization. This is a radical new technology that is just gaining momentum over the last few years. You'll know it most from Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin being the global currency that is, rather than having a bank, a centralized bank that is mediating transactions, it actually distributes the ledger of transactions across an entire network. So if you imagine thousands or millions of computers on the network are each acting as a part of the ledger of that transaction. So whenever you exchange Bitcoin for something else, there are actually millions of computers being asked whether that transaction is legitimate or not. And if it is, then it goes through, and that transaction is permanently added to a record on that blockchain. So this is all, it's a deep dive into a new technology, but what it essentially means is that the bank, what it provided in terms of security and privacy, blockchain and the secret agent API might be able to do it better. And I say might because we don't know yet, right? This is still a very early experiment, but I know there's a lot of banks that are very worried about it. They're taking it very seriously. And a lot of the research we've been doing at the Institute for the Future has been showing how this idea of taking something that was centralized and then distributing it in a peer-to-peer model, what it does is it takes out the weak points in the middle, that place that held all of the power, that bank, that central node that was susceptible to weakness and to corruption, right? So if weakness and corruption, if trust are issues, the blockchain provides a very provocative and intriguing possibility of how to share data in a way that maximizes individual privacy, but then actually creates a more transparent record of activity than anything else we've created. And there's even sort of talk in the crypto community that you might be able to run entire organizations this way, right? The so-called decentralized autonomous corporation, which is a very interesting rabbit hole if you want to follow that later. So the secret agent is pseudonymous and private, like I said. It's anonymous up until you identify yourself, and then it's completely transparent. It works well for creating and facilitating high-trust interactions in low-trust environments. It's only recently discovered, though. We don't know a lot about it. But we do know that it's not really vulnerable to traditional regulation, right? Because there's no one headquarters. So it means that criminal innovation is just as easy as formal innovation. And in fact, it is sort of gray market and black market groups that are innovating the most in the space in a lot of ways, things like the Silk Road. But I think what's interesting, and this is a lot of the research we've done this last year, is that technology, like we talked about earlier, it's neither good nor bad nor neutral. That technology might hold the key to a lot of civic and small nonprofit organizations to be able to harness the power of a distributed platform in a way that nobody else would be incentivized to create such a thing because it inherently destabilizes centralized organizations that hold power. Right? So that's a lot. If the world feels chaotic right now, it's because, I believe, we're actively deconstructing the institutions of our past in order to build the foundations of our future. Amidst the turmoil of this transition, the opportunity and the challenge of the next decade is not so much to keep up or to reconnect those fragments that I talked about, to rebuild the world that we knew, but to build a world that actually works for a hyper-connected global population of 8 billion people. I'd like to leave you with 2 takeaways to come away with tonight. And the first is that your network strategy that you develop is not just an experiment. As we've seen, these APIs, you are going to be using more of them in the next few years. There's just no question about that. But you will be choosing, whether you choose or not, species of them, right? That's that neutral thing again. These are all choices about what are the value models, what are the transaction models that you are going to support. Because even though they might start small in one initiative, APIs grow very quickly in their communities. And your network strategy is really a bid for the kind of future that you want to inhabit. The values that you place in those little APIs are going to grow to dominate our organizations and our society over the next 10, 20, 30 years as more of the world connects together in these ways. It's all through APIs, all of this data. The second is that because of this, right now, and over the next few years, is the primary window of opportunity for developing what we call a generation of positive platforms. So the choices that you make, whether you choose to make a car sharing service that maximizes the commons or that maximizes the revenue of an organization, those are choices that we'll make with the APIs that we use to mediate those interactions. That'll happen on a day-by-day basis, millions of times a second, right? So right now, those precedents aren't set, but the decisions that you make over the next few years with your organizations will grow to set the precedents for the cultures and the social contracts that we inhabit and that the next generation will inhabit. So the fact that we don't know where to start, I heard in the panel was great. I think there's a big theme of what I've heard today that there's a lot of interest in this area, but then a wide variety of opinions and ideas about where to start or where it's going. That's a feature, not a bug. That means that the choices we make right now can be at the level of what do we value? What do we want the outcomes of this to be? And we can start asking audacious questions, and those will start to reveal the paths forward. We have an initiative at the Institute for the Future that is working on this, that is trying to explore these questions, and particularly as they affect work and jobs, the jobs that are being lost to automation, and just to being sort of micro-worked out, right? Increasingly sort of below the API economy ways. So Uber drivers, the micro-workers that are piecing together bits of work from these small tasks. We have a cross-sector panel of people, folks from like Brad Smith, CEO of Inuit, and Gavin Newsom, Laszlo Bock, who's in charge of people ops at Google, a lot of people trying to come together to explore these questions and to find ways and levers to start building these positive platforms. So if you're interested in that, come stop by our office. We'd love to talk to you about it. And that's it. Thank you. So I go into a kind of a fugue state when I speak, and I have no idea how much time passed, but I know there's a question and answer section now. Or if you need to leave, I'm not offended, but if you have any questions, I think we have a few minutes to answer those.
Somewhere in there, you mentioned in one of the models, I don't remember whether it was the secret agent or the community maker, an opportunity for small nonprofits, but I didn't catch what that opportunity was that you were talking about.
Yeah, so I have a lot of love for small nonprofits. My wife is a co-founder of one, and so I think about this a lot with her. They work with college students, and they're trying to leverage these relationships that they have in new ways. And I think the biggest thing actually is to not just assume that there's open and closed. I think that's the point of having these different species, trying to elevate this idea of API from sort of a technical implementation to sort of a more accessible metaphor, is that each of these 4 subspecies are going to be, I think, ideally operating together within any organization or any service, because they all have different strengths and weaknesses, and purely open APIs have a lot of weaknesses, right? There's no way to support them financially. There's no incentive to model that data so that, that the features are clear, right? It seems to be these sort of honest merchant transactional APIs that create the best services, and so people draw towards those. But I think for nonprofits and organizations to take some learnings from what they're doing well, and to even not be afraid to have some models that in some cases charge money more than you might want to, sort of from a purely ideal standpoint, so that you can sort of create the experiences that will actually benefit them better in the long term. And then be aware, though, of when, if you have data that you're not using, creating community trust and goodwill and innovation, it is often best to use those community maker APIs. So this talk came out of our 10-year forecast program that I'm the director of, and we do have a toolkit as well that sort of helps you, if you are interested, to sort of step through this a little bit more detail, to think through the implications for a network strategy. That's something we provide. But I think that the opportunities for nonprofits are to think more broadly than just open and closed data, to think about the trade-offs, and to think about the value transactions in particular that you want to participate in.
So the idea of using APIs to get different departments in seamless communication makes a lot of sense to me, and to not force people to change their own behavior and still get what I need out of them so they can do my bidding, right? Always the goal. That makes sense. I don't know how to get to it, and I think you're saying this as well, so that it makes sense for my donors as well. So that I can either ask or offer something, or that they can, and that's the part. And I'm not even sure that I'm saying it right.
Yeah, so what this might feel a little sort of like parallel to that, but the example that brings to mind for me is what are the relationships that you want and that need to be people relationships? So like a donor and organization relationship, that's an actual people relationship, right? So it's going to be very hard to automate that one away. But I think what you can do is you can get rid of the administrative burdens that are getting in the way of that relationship. So at hospitals, for example, the last few times I've been for my birth of my children, so many cases I've seen nurses get frustrated because they're just trying to like support a new mother and to sort of provide instruction to sort of a panicked new father, but they are hindered at every step by the technology that they use to enter in the data about what's going on. I had one case where I couldn't bring my dad into a cancer treatment that he needed because the clocks had reset the night before, and so the system just wouldn't let her in to essentially accomplish the same task that a clipboard and pencil would accomplish, right? So a lot of cases we create technology, and then that technology forms barriers to the things that we're actually trying to do. And I think that part of what I'm also trying to tease out here too is that there are some things that you just would be better off not having to think about at all, that you can use technology like this to try to slowly pare away those administrative headaches and then the expertise that is required of good people to do those things, right? So I don't think people should gain literacy about computers. I think computers, and we're getting closer to this, should gain literacy about people, right? So that you can focus on community, on relationships, on and not focus on in a donor relationship numbers necessarily even, that maybe doesn't quite answer your question, but in that area, hopefully.
Hi, it's just a terrific presentation. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the risk side of choice and access. So envision dropping your car off for someone else to use while you're away. How does the insurance industry think about that, or wait, that someone gets into an accident in your car that you've loaned through another service? So I wonder if you could make a comment on that, or does it matter? Does what people want overcome some of the traditional risks and regulations and barriers that have been put in place in the past?
Yeah, I think we live in an interesting time where it is difficult to know what problems are just going to exist forever and which ones are just on the verge of being solved, right? And that is a very tricky thing. I think in the case of insurance, I would actually put it in the ones that are about to be solved, because I would maybe generalize it to say that any industry or obstacle that relies on just communicating information fundamentally can be solved much more easily and cheaply by APIs. So on the risk side for cars, that we are in a period where it's a little bit of a Wild West, right? Who knows who's going to honor what things? Essentially, as you get into like blockchain, the regulatory frameworks have no idea what to do with things like blockchain, right? So what do you do? They've determined that Bitcoins are property and not currency, and it's just we need to rethink a lot of how we talk about these things at a policy level. But for insurance, like there's a great signal I heard recently out of Germany called Friendsurance, and what they've done is they have outsourced small claims within their insurance company to the social networks of people that you know. So people that know you, can vouch for you, have a reputation, have things on the line. A lot of the things that they would have to pay overhead and service fees that you would have to pay for in order to have insurance, that they can just sort of automate out through social networks, combining data and people in interesting ways to provide effective, probably more effective insurance to you at a much cheaper rate. So I would say that in the case of that, like the flight car, tracking what people are doing and what we expect from them is one of those things that's a lot easier. From an organizational standpoint, if you're going to suddenly switch from being an organization to a platform, now obviously there's more risks in that, because maybe that platform proposition has a high value, maybe it has no value, right? And I think every organization is aware of that risk. I talked to a lot of banks recently that are worried about that. Like, are we something that cannot die, or that why would we exist, right? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that I see a lot of people asking these days.
I have the same question about the risks as well. So a lot of open data advocates are not necessarily fans of APIs. And I think when we are talking about the nonprofit sector, you mentioned it, you touched on it, but to go a bit deeper in the question of power. So as you mentioned, there's no business models for open APIs.
Well,
right?
yeah.
What does that mean for the nonprofit sector? Is this a question of transferring government information gathering and sharing to private information gathering and sharing? And the question of governance is a really big deal. When you use an API, it's controlled by one entity. So if you look at international aid, what they've done to organize international aid recently with the IID network, they've done away with that. Instead, they use XML and a central registry where you can go see who has that information. So it's a great presentation on what APIs are, I think, for this for the sector. But the idea that there does need to be further thought on what do we want to have API and centralized, and what do we want to make sure that we can still go access ourselves without having to go through a central for-profit provider.
Yeah, I totally agree with parts of the premise, but I think there's nuances here that there's, you know, even in open sharing, like they're not advocates for APIs because APIs have become to associated with like Microsoft, right? That you sort of, you own the way that that data gets shared, and then you are a proprietary solution that has all control of it, like you're saying. But even in open data solutions, there are still APIs, right? They're just open APIs. And so the API is just the social contract, I think. And so whatever kind of value transaction that you can imagine wanting to have, you can encode into an API. Is part of what I'm trying to get at, where you might have sensitive information about people, for example, that you don't want to just share because there's privacy concerns, but they say at like the smart city level, as we get closer towards city governments thinking about leveraging a lot of underutilized labor to help with sort of civic tasks. If somebody has a reputation score and sort of a skill score, and who is measuring all these things is the question, then you could give them access when it's appropriate. It does not address the fundamental question of who has the power, though. And that's why I end with my slide with what do you value? Because I think we need to answer that question before any of this really matters. And that's also why I introduced blockchain at the peril of introducing a complicated concept at the end of a long presentation. Because blockchain, the answer is nobody and everybody, right? And so it's a very radical rethinking of what organizations are. But the early sort of proof of concepts of have made it so that there really are no central nodes within blockchain that can be corrupted or controlled by one entity, as long as you agree on the sort of the code that was laid out when the chain was first created. So I think personally that there's a lot of exploration to do in that space for civic and nonprofit organizations, because I think that addresses it in a way that gives us an opportunity to do things we haven't done before, because we've never been able to create something like that before.